Buonasera a tutti.
Good afternoon. I would like to address you as an enologist and wine consultant. I work in the Languedoc-Roussillon area, Spain and Portugal, so the south of Europe, let's say. In the past years, I have been working as a consultant for approximately 40 producers.
Les problématiques que je rencontre sont des problématiques de terrain dont je vais vous parler.
And actually, the problems I encounter are connected to the soil and specifically the location of my clients in rather warm areas where I have been doing bioprotection for years now. Actually, this is active bioprotection because in the activation of these solutions, we have the production of compounds, or we can avoid producing compounds which could be harmful to some profiles of wine. We have water stress problems, nutritional stress issues, we have ripening problems, we have a high alcohol content in Spain, we have these issues especially. And we also have varieties which tend to oxidize and high pH whites and reds, which are sensitive to Brettanomyces, and they are rich in a precursor that was found especially in Carignan and Mourvèdre. And then we have also commercial wines with the thiolic and terpenic profile, and reds, which are rich and harmonious. So we will try and see how we can go for active bioprotection so as to be able to solve 5 problems that I selected. First of all, the aggressivity of reds. Wines which are astringent to the palate because of lack of roundness or for other problems. The point is to work on tannins and make them rounder. Then second element is the lack of freshness linked to aggressivity or heaviness of aromas, which sometimes are oxidative. In this case, the solution is actually that of producing acidity to give a fresher taste and also reduce oxidative and heavy aromas. The third problem is that of wines without the addition of SO2. And with the Hansen's group, we have been working together on this, and now I vinify 2 million wines per year where no SO2 is added. These are wines where the total sulfur is less than 10 ppm, and you replace sulfur, which would be put in the tank, with bioprotection instruments and means with Saccharomyces or lactobacillus to replace sulfur. We have then another issue, which is very important for us all, which is Brettanomyces, whereby this problem intertwines also with the abundance in phenolic acids, which is present in the south of the continent. So we reduce extraction of these acids by eliminating sulfur, which is a poor vinifier, and have a positive microflora. This is, for me, a dynamic succession of populations. The maceration of a full grape, which has not been destemmed. It is a carbonic maceration, as it is called in the south of Spain. So we have the maceration of the full bunch with problems of lactic acid or extractions due to the stems or Brettanomyces problems, which often are combined with the presence of sugar. First of all, the aggressivity of reds. This is a tactile approach to the palate between roundness and structure. We have varietal aspects here in stressed vineyards with a lack of balance between tannins and anthocyanins, and all this is also linked to extractions which sometimes are excessive in the alcoholic phase. When you stop at a density of about 1030, if you have Grenache grapes with 16 as a potential alcohol and Merlot at 12, alcohol is not the same of this density. So oftentimes extraction is excessive, so much so that if you add SO2 acting as a solvent, the point with bioprotection is that of eliminating sulfur. It is a good preservative, and it is very bad, though, for vinification under other viewpoints, especially in the south of Spain. So what we do is to implement a Saccharomyces yeast so that you have this perception of roundness on the palate. As a matter of fact, with Torolospera del Brucchi, when not adding SO2 in 24 to 48 hours without addition of SC, we have a higher quantity of polysaccharides, and this can be perceived. This means that when using this technique, we have a higher and more harmonious perception, and even more so because we eliminated SO2. This is a technique that I adopted today in the majority of Mediterranean areas where you reach a high ripeness of grapes, also due to the drying process on the vine. The objective is that of having more harmonious wines. Lack of freshness. Let's go back to this topic. This is also linked to climate change. And ripeness here becomes a key issue in areas and varieties such as Tempranillo, Cabernet Sauvignon, wines where you have pH above 3.8, 3.9. We try and compensate this lack of acidity with fresh aromas and not heavy aromas or oxidative aromas. And indeed, during malolactic fermentation, in general, we tend to have a high percentage of production of diacetyl. So we have to see how we can avoid these hints of dairy products and butter. So we do not add SO2, as I said, and the objective is that of having controlled oxidation and browning in whites, where you eliminate the phenols, which with the flavonols and quinones and oxidization of the former lead to the browning effect, which often are linked to a bitter taste. We use non-Saccharomyces yeasts, which make it possible from the very beginning to reveal the potential aromas, and we also can acidify because of the freshness, or rather acidity, contributes to freshness on the palate. We use non-Saccharomyces yeasts such as Aracancea, thermotolerance, and then malolactic fermentation should not increase the heaviness. What is controlled oxygenization? Without adding SO2, the point here is to eliminate flavonols by means of quinones, which means that you achieve more stability and at the same time you avoid the presence of undesired aromas. You replace sulfur in this way so that in white varieties you eliminate oxidation phenomena. We talk about quantities of oxygen ranging from 10 to 30 milligrams per liter, which has nothing to do, of course, with hyperoxygenation at those levels. In those phases, without adding SO2 for 48 hours after removing the dregs, you can use the yeast to produce lactic acid, which in turn can be metabolized during the alcoholic fermentation to produce positive aromatic esters. And then the last association, which is interesting in this phase, consists in profiting from the capability of saying a negative bacterium to avoid additional heavy butter nuances during the malolactic fermentation. Here we see the various inoculations and their sequence. There is a production of lactic and succinic acid then during malolactic fermentation, possibly, and knowing that it is also a way to stabilize white and rosé wines, you continue without, again, causing a butter nuance. The topic I've been working at in the past 4 years focuses and rotates around the need to abide by the rules that entail that you use no SO2. So let's see what we can do in order to avoid using SO2. We have to use something that replaces it from the very beginning. We will use microorganisms which are faster than SC, which has to be rehydrated. During the implantation period, we will have microorganisms which are adapted and which are suitable to the implantation to a natural means, which means that from the harvesting cart or wagon and down to the tank and so on and so forth. And we also explored the capability of these microorganisms of inhibiting production, say, of lactic acid, which we know is not not only limited by the concerto. We have a production of acid which is interesting, which makes it possible to stabilize wines that will never be added SO2 during their entire life. This is possible, and it can be interesting to have wines which have not been added sulfites and are aromatic when the raw material does not have phenolic or oxidative features. So we have a limited value of flavonol, so we have a glutathione level which is rather high. And in this case, it's interesting not to go for the oxidative way and use instead a microorganism in the vineyard already in order to block oxidation processes of mosts. This means rapidly consuming dissolved oxygen. The solution we went for in the case of aromatic varieties such as Verdejo and Sauvignon Colomba or Vermentino, which have a fresh, flowery and profile with a phenolic profile which does not entail oxidation, well, there we will have the possibility of going for this type of bioprotection. If we want a rosé wine which is aromatic or a red wine which has to be aromatic, the usefulness of Picchia Cloveri is that of revealing the varietal aromatic profile with a booster effect on fermentation features. Here we see the possibility of talking about something that you can taste, because we will have a tasting of products with Fruit Zen starting from 4 o'clock today. And so you will taste wines with or without added sulfites. Unsulfurized wines make it possible to go down to the end of the chain with malolactic processes which do not mask the features of the whites and reds as well. And again, we do not add sulfites. With a citrate negative bacterium, which is added. And without the citrate uptake, you have this sort of revolution, because you will see that you avoid the butter taste that otherwise would be present. Here we see the recipe that I apply to fresh aromatic profiles, Sauvignon-like, in case of wines where no sulfur was added. here we have the yeast that is implanted without rehydration, which is used when harvesting, and then it is followed, alcoholic fermentation is followed by malolactic fermentation, where you have no development of these bitter aromas and nuances. And indeed, you need malolactic fermentation because malolactic fermentation is a sort of ethanol consuming factory. Also in case of SC, which does not produce acetaldehyde and sulfites, anyway, it is important to use residual acetaldehyde, which was produced during the previous fermentation process. Since you have no sulfur, you have to have a malolactic fermentation, which has to be rapid, and only by means of inoculating you will be able to degrade rapidly malic acid without oxidative processes which are linked to peroxidation of alcohol and ethanol without adding sulfur and sulfites. Why am I insisting on that? Clearly, we do not want whites or rosé wines with apple hints, but in reds we have a constraint, and that is the mousy taste, which is linked to the oxidative process of a molecule coming from Brettanomyces or other compounds, which you see on the picture, and which have an aromatic power which is very strong. So if you have a rapid malolactic fermentation in this case, you will never go through oxidation, and you will never have the mousy profile. We use inoculation techniques with bacteria which can adapt to all conditions. And I'm talking about fermentation, of course, and that entails degrees and temperature and pH. The problem of Brettanomyces is not specific to and limited to the south of Spain or France. It is actually linked both to varietal and winemaking factors. Actually, in the south of France, we often have a deterioration of the skins due to the presence of worms and Carignan, Mourvèdre, which prevail in my area, have barotomeric high levels, barotomeric acid, and Brettanomyces in pre-fermentation phases and in between alcoholic and malolactic fermentation enjoys and benefits from all these factors. And the same goes for uncompleted alcoholic fermentation. We know that the presence of some milligrams of glucose and fructose is sufficient to have significant quantities of ethyl phenols for certain populations of Brettanomyces. What we do there is to have a dynamic sequence of populations from the tank to malolactic fermentation. So after this step, the point is to go back and use sulfites due to their antiseptic function in function of pH and temperature, and that is what we called active sulfur. The microorganisms which are used are listed there, and you see we use non-Saccharomyces yeasts which have the capability of implanting themselves in the medium, which means that we eliminate the need for sulfites, which is not our ally in the warm area. It is so because this is an instrument that selects the worst microorganisms. It is very effective on Colicera and others, but sometimes it is not so effective on Brettanomyces. So it selects the most resistant microorganism, which then will develop, especially during the malolactic phase, and this will entail the need for additional sulfating. here we change strategy and we change the sequence of the inoculations at the beginning and at the end of the malolactic fermentation with suitable bacteria. Here I would like to go back to the importance of picking the right microorganisms in the tank. And indeed, based on my experience, I can say that in these areas where you have a prevalence of Brettanomyces, the Lactancea thermotolerance that produces lactic acid is an interesting option to have a lower pH wine, which is easier to control at 0.6, 0.7 grams per liter during the fining phase. There is then a technique which should be better controlled, and I'm talking about the maceration of unstemmed bunches, which again is fashionable in my area because this makes the aromatic profile of wines more expressive. Here we limit mechanical extractions. Sometimes small containers are used, and there is a sort of infusion where the compounds of grapes are simply left in the wine, and we have heterofermentation problems because during fermentation we have yeasts and bacteria side by side, and this means having a risk for a higher production of acetyl on the part of Cloacaera and Picolata and acetic bacteria. And then when pressing, we will have a release of sugars with a peak of lactic bacteria. The causes for failure are known, and the interests for bioprotection in this phase focuses on not using sulfites. Why? Because they give a bad solvent. We should avoid extracting phenolic acids when the grapes are ripe, and extracting vegetal notes from stems is not desirable when vinification is performed without destemming. We benefit from the absence of sulfites to use a non-Saccharomyces yeast, which compensates for the release of potassium, which is linked to the presence of stems. And at the same time, we can have bacteria which are homofermentative bacteria, since the grapes have been put in the tank in order to make the medium drier and avoid when pressing an excessive release of malic acid and peaks of autochthonous bacteria. As a matter of fact, ethyl acetate is the enemy of this type of maceration, with productions which are significant and which are complex to eliminate afterwards. The strategies that can be deployed include something that I would like to go back to after Sophie mentioned them, and it is the role of Viniflora nova, Lactobacillus plantarum, vis-à-vis contaminating microorganisms which proliferate in these pre-fermentation phases with the production of acetic acid, which can be controlled in this way, and with the appearance of molds which are also controlled. What can we propose in the case of maceration of unstemmed grapes? Well, we have a control of the pre-fermentation phase, which can possibly be integrated with re-inoculation of Enococcus eni at the end of the pressing, if malic acid is still significantly present, and that is consumed by Lactobacillus plantarum. So in 25 minutes, I managed to provide you an overview of a number of topics which are very important in the area I work in. I work with wineries which also produce, and cooperatives which produce as many as 500,000 hectoliters, and those small wineries which work at very lower levels, 1,000 hectoliters or so. And so here we had solutions which can be used by everybody, and the technological issues have been solved. So these are methods which make it possible to work significant amounts and volumes without adding sulfites and without using products which would raise the final cost of wine. Biotechnology is the most natural approach, and it also solves the problem of Brettanomyces, which is clear in Bordeaux, Le Corbière, and also in the north of Portugal. This is a technique which has already proven how reliable it is. It boasts some history now, and I hope that I convinced you. Thank you very much.